Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthi, and today I am very honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Mr. Courtney Stadd. Right as Elon Musk was just leaving his elementary school years, Mr. Stadd was teaming up with fellow entrepreneurs to break the US government's strange hold on launch vehicles and bring a competitive marketplace spirit to the aerospace sector. Mr. Stadd held management positions at the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the White House, and worked directly with three NASA administrators, including as Chief of Staff and White House Liaison. At the White House, he helped draft numerous presidential directives encouraging a competitive commercial space industry, including directing NASA to purchase launch services. Mr. Stadd is currently part of the founding team of a Pathfinder optical satellite telecom venture, Laser Light Communications, and its sister company, CommStar, dedicated to offering commercial space communications for Moon to Earth and eventually beyond. Mr. Stadd is different from many of the space champions profiled to date. He is not an academic researcher nor a lifetime government official, but in his words, an entrepreneur who has brought his passions for policy, markets, and business to carve out a career path, helping build the policy, regulatory, public-private frameworks for the emerging commercial space markets. I could go all day talking about Mr. Stadd's remarkable contributions to the space industry. He is such an amazing space champion, and I'm so honored to be able to talk with him. Welcome, Mr. Stadd. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to conduct this interview.
Well, it's a privilege to be here. And I must say that when you reached out and I had a chance to look at the Ignite website, I was very excited. I had no choice but to participate in a very distinguished list of people you've interviewed to date. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words. And before we get into understanding more of your journey of how you got into the space industry, first I'd like to know more about your typical day. What do you currently do and how does it run?
Well, I have been in the business for 40 years. So like many of your listeners, I suspect we're living off a few hours sleep is possible. I started out with maybe 5-6 hours a day, and then working, for 18-hour days was not rare. Nowadays, I like to get about 7 hours, and I start my day usually by catching up on the news in the space arena. Jeff Faust is first up. He's a quite prominent reporter for Space News, provides an excellent morning summary of the highlights in the commercial space industry here and abroad. A friend of mine is a publisher of Space Intel Report, and I find that a useful summary. And Edward Elgood of Space Florida puts out an extraordinarily good summary of the week's events. And it normally takes me a couple of days to plow through that. So that's morning. And then I also use the morning for email catch up, drafting memos, doing some client work. I'm currently a consultant to several commercial clients, which I gather we'll get to. And then because I have clients that work in different time zones, as the afternoon proceeds, I reach out to them and have discussions and meetings and Zoom videos and so forth, like we're having through the day. So that's a sense of the day, interspersed with some volunteer that I do for different educational groups, STEM-related groups during the week.
Yeah, I'm so glad to see that you're able to balance your life a little bit. I mean, of course, it's shorter hours than previously and still able to do so much out in the space industry as well. So volunteering and getting into the educational side and consulting. So that's really great. And in the commercial sector, you were associated with a range of Pathfinder industry sectors, including like commercial space launch vehicles, GPS, high resolution satellite remote sensing, commercial inflatable space modules, and telecommunications. So could you tell us some more of some of the interesting projects and work that you've conducted?
Sure. Been very lucky in that regard that during the arc of my career, I had the opportunity to work with some of these what I'll call foundational industries. So let's start with GPS. Majority of your listeners take for granted the fact that they, using their smartphone, for example, have a pretty precise sense of where they are location-wise. and take it for granted when using their Waze or whatever their preferred navigation system, that it's all reliant on this system. And I worked with Charlie Trimble. He was one of the pioneers developing the commercial use of GPS. And he was a great mentor of mine way back in the 80s. He was working for Hewlett-Packard, and he noticed that there was a license for navigation positioning that they weren't really making good use of. And so he had the vision to take that license and eventually commercialize it and make it the super success that it is. I find it of great irony that Charlie was legally blind, and yet here he is, one of the leading inventors of position navigation technology. And from that effort, he spun off a whole array of enterprises in this business. The other thing about GPS that I was proud to be part of is that there was a great debate regarding whether the United States ought to make GPS free at the basic level to the world. And there was a debate about that. And there were some who felt that the taxpayer warranted having the investment reimbursed and let's charge price for it. And during the Reagan administration, but it was bipartisan support, the decision was made to provide that for free. Now, augmented services have costs associated with them in pricing, but the basic service meant that the United States GPS became the baseline. And that has had remarkable economic and national security benefits. And I was part of a community of people who encouraged both the presidential policies, and then I had the honor of working with the late Senator McCain and his staff to incorporate that into legislation. So anytime I talk about my role, please recognize it's a team sport, and there are a lot of us. We is very critical when talking about these sorts of changes. You made reference to remote sensing. When I was at the Space Council, White House Space Council in the late 80s, we pushed for commercializing, making available these high resolution optical systems. We got a lot of pushback by the intelligence community, defense, concerned about, once again, allowing the public at large access to these technologies. And I recall the late Dr. Edward Teller, who's known for inventing or co-inventing the hydrogen bomb. He felt it was very important that remote sensing, at least at a certain resolution, high resolution, be made available to the world at large, that it would contribute to stability in the world, allowing the public to have transparency as to what North Korea may be up to, or some of the other trouble spots in the world. And I think he left a rather problematic legacy, Dr. Teller, but I do think one of the legacies he left that it's held true is that having a world in which these satellites are making the resources of the world and including their trouble spots accessible has indeed led to stability. And I think that's been a good thing. And being part of that, I'm very proud of that. And I was part of the founding of one of the early companies that began to commercialize those products and services. Another one had to do with, you say inflatables, we refer to them as expandables. And I had the honor of working with Bob Bigelow in the early 2000s. He made his money in real estate, but his passion had been for space since he was a little boy. And once he had achieved his literally billion dollar fortune, he opted to take a healthy portion of that and put it into what he was looking for at the time was a transformational space technology. And NASA had been developing these inflatable or expandables. For the listeners not acquainted with it, imagine taking your tire and blowing it up, and that allows you to put a small piece of mass on a rocket, and when it gets to space, you can actually literally blow it up and achieve many factors more mass size for less cost, if versus being a metallic or whatever type material. And he took this technology that NASA had essentially walked away from for a lot of reasons, and developed it. And I was very impressed with the resources and the engineering talent he put into it. And his vision was to have these very large expandables that would act as laboratories, act as lodging facilities, entertainment facilities, so forth and so on, hotels perhaps at some point, that could be leased or owned by other entities, corporate and governments as well. And he did succeed in deploying one that's called the beam, that as we speak at this very instant is connected to the space station. But this is an example of what I call mistaking technical possibility for market opportunity. As we developed that capability, the cost of transportation, although coming down, did not come down significantly enough to justify launching these expandables and justify bringing up the number of passengers and users that one might have expected. So there was a phasing problem. And so that effort has sort of languished for the moment. Personally, I believe that either Bigelow or somebody else in the marketplace here or abroad will pick up and run with that concept once again transportation costs come down significantly. So those are a few examples.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I noticed how you were mentioning a lot on commercialization and access of knowledge to the public. And you're a huge propellant on that. So what are your thoughts on the future of commercialization in space and its importance?
I think it's here now. I think for you and your peers, it is very difficult to imagine a more exciting time to be looking at potential careers in commercial space. I grew up regrettably during a period where the government had what I'll call a monopsony, or the sole buyer of services. And so there was a dearth of product differentiation in services and products in space. NASA was essentially it and its contractors. That has fortunately radically changed over the past generation, particularly in the last 10 or 12 years. Many more products, rockets, satellites, platforms, either are in operation or being developed. I would say almost every day, certainly every week, new ventures, both here and abroad, are surfacing. And so I think the potential for a robust commercial space ecosystem is extraordinarily promising. Now, many of those ventures will fail, many will stumble, but that's okay. The good news is that in the year 2021, we have so many and such a diversity that a healthy subset of those ventures will go on. And I was involved with a company called Vector Launch. We raised $100 million. And for a lot of reasons, most of the reasons were self-inflicted wounds, the company did not get traction. Well, what happened? Many of us scurried off to other ventures. So the experiences, the learning curve that we acquired has now benefited the Rocket Labs, the Blue Origins, the SpaceXs, the Virgin Galactics. So to me, this is an extraordinary period of time for commercial space. And if you allow the cliche, the genie is out of the bottle, there's no turning back. And it's now really a question of execution at this point.
Yeah, the excitement of a lot of private space companies being started up and being more prominent in different space exploration missions is really exciting. I feel like space has gotten a lot more popular these days on social media, especially because so many people have been involved, so many more jobs. And so I definitely agree with that.
Very much so.
Yeah. And as a part of Capital Alliance Solutions, which is a Washington, D.C. based management consulting firm whose current clients include a range of commercial space clients, what is your goal and vision for the future with the company?
Well, I chose Capital Alliance Solutions purposely, capital, the nation's capital,
Mhm.
which I often half facetiously refer to as 10 square miles surrounded by reality. So you've got the capital, you've got Alliance, which I try to, through my work, to bring a disparate group of people, public, private sector people together. And then solutions. I've tried to spend a life focused on trying to be it a policy goal to end up with a policy that can be executed and have as wide a benefit as possible. And if it involves corporate, to try to drive that toward revenue that benefits the bottom line. So that's Capital Alliance Solutions. And the array of clients I have today, and I do try to, I'm at a point in life where I have the honor, the luxury of sort of choosing what I want to do. And I am blessed by having an array of clients that are game changers. So I work with one company, for example, that has developed low cost above ground buoyancy training tanks for prospective astronaut space travelers. We've also built low cost helmet and spacesuits that are qualified for spacewalking. With all due respect, and I have an enormous amount of respect for Elon Musk, those fancy space suits that you see, or space flight suits in Dragon, you'd last about 7 or 8 seconds if you went out of the capsule. They're not built for EVAs, spacewalks. So trying to introduce tools at low cost to help build the infrastructure for space is something that really motivates me. I'm working with a software company. We provide about 85% of the quality assurance software support for defense aerospace and more in the commercial space arena. I'm working with a spaceport, and I have been a long time supporter. The concern I have, frankly, on this topic is that the government is looking at consolidating the East and West test ranges into some sort of Amtrak-like national corporation. And my fear, always have a fear when Uncle Sam gets involved in a big way, heavy-handed way, is that it might have the unforeseen consequence of displacing some of these new commercial space ports that are still fragile and need the cooperation of the government, not the government as a competitor. Seems to be a running theme through my life, dealing with the government as a competitor. And you mentioned my work with this optical satellite system. Please note that when Scotty on Star Trek or the other protagonists on The Expanse, one of my favorite sci-fi series, they're using optical communications to communicate. And oftentimes when we talk about space exploration, we forget that communications is key, critical. And NASA has really lagged in that area. The Deep Space Network that has done so much good work over the decades, after all, we rely on it for perseverance and send its incredible imaging back, but it's really not a network, it's a point-to-point. And I'm working with people in the telecommunications business who understand true networks. And so we're building this optical network in low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, I should say. And we're working with some marquee contractors, hope to begin to get that deployed in 22, 23. We have a sister company called CommStar, and that company seeks to be one of the first commercial deep space comm. So we'll be developing a Wi-Fi between Earth, Moon, laying the groundwork for beyond, with the initial satellite due in the early 2020s at L1, says Lunar, just in time as we begin to see commercial robots begin to be deployed to the lunar surface. So that's a set of appetizers as the type of work I'm involved with.
Yeah, that is so exciting and amazing. I can't really wait to see how Capital Alliance Solutions grows and, is able to provide so much to the space industry. Your projects that you've been working on sound Really cool.
Thank
And
you.
as a NASA chief of staff and White House liaison, I am sure you have had some very interesting stories and cool events you organized or were even a part of, or projects that you have advocated for. So could you please share a story or two with us about your job as a White House liaison?
Yeah, the hard part is limiting it to a couple of stories, but let me see. One was really the honor of leading the astronauts who were returning from the space station or from shuttle missions to meet with the president and going to the Oval Office. That was always a great treat. In fact, I have a quick story on that. I remember once, I'm currently an independent, but I was working for a Republican president at the time, President George W. Bush. And I remember I was bringing a shuttle crew to visit him, and one of the astronauts was quite resistant. In fact, this individual was clearly not a supporter of the president, and in addition, was refusing to wear the NASA spaceflight suit. And it got so contentious that I actually had to go to that person's boss back at Johnson Space Center to get them directed to wear the spaceflight suit. And I'm glad I did, because when we showed up, there was a whole contingent of congressional leadership, both Democratic, Republican. And the minute they saw the astronauts in their spacesuits, in their spaceflight suits, they migrated over. We had pictures taken. And later on, those pictures were posted in the White House area. And I remember saying to the commander of the astronauts, I said, that's why I was encouraging you to wear your suit, because that distinguishes you from other people. Baseball players show up in their suits or dresses or whatever, pantsuits, but astronauts are astronauts. And from the standpoint of the NASA meatball or whatever, it certainly is a great way to brand it. Other honor was during the wake of the tragedy of the Columbia accident. I was given the distinct and sacred duty of taking Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon's remains back to Israel and delivering them directly to the prime minister. And that was an extraordinary time, and many, many stories from that. In fact, that actually led to my interest in doing a documentary about that incredible crew on Columbia. And for those interested, you can find it on the PBS archive. It's called Space Shuttle Columbia Mission of Hope. And that led me to Tom Hanks's company. And when I was left NASA and was a private citizen, we worked with Tom Hanks's people and co-produced that documentary. So that was a terrific opportunity. And then I had a chance to fly on the KC-135, better known as the Vomit Comet, over the Gulf of Mexico, to give me a sense of the importance of that research program. And then I flew at the invitation of Dryden Air Force Base, now called the Armstrong Air Force Base, where we house our F-15s, do a lot of aeronautical research. And they wanted somebody at my level at a headquarters to experience the importance of the work they were doing with the Defense Department. And so frankly, how could I not do it? So I was able to be taken up in an F-18, and my really first experience with the microgravity environment was in the F-15. We did interesting parabolics, which prepared me for the Vomit Comet experience. But I really was very impressed with the aeronautic research that they were doing. By the way, when you fly commercial, you try to avoid turbulence. In this instance, part of the research was flying into turbulence purposely, as well as flying wing to wing with other aircraft to try to see if we could not achieve additional efficiencies by riding in the wake of other aircraft. That was an interesting experience, to say the least. So those are a few that come to mind. Finally, I'll say this. One of the initiatives I'm most proud of was called Freedom to Manage. And that was where I organized all civil service, non-political civil service servants of different disciplines. And we went to all the 10 NASA centers. There are 9 plus JPL. JPL is not a formal civil service site, but it's part of the NASA family, of course. And we would brief the populations at the different centers, people of all civil service ranks, and say, identify policies, rules, regulations, procedures that you consider to be really dumb, that the rationale has been long lost and are really impeding you doing your job as effectively as you might. And I'm proud to say that the team I was working with, we managed to fix big and small about 1,000 different issues. So about 1,000 reforms were made. And that's one that I'm quite proud of. I'm hoping the current administration might resurrect a variation of it. In fact, I've suggested that to the new leadership at NASA because I think it's a good thing to revisit every decade or so.
Yeah, those sound like some amazing experiences. I definitely have to check out that documentary right after this. I think, the best part about being in the space industry is not only being able to represent your country or the world and humanity into going into space, but it's also like the cool experiences you have, the diverse individuals you meet with like-minded thoughts. Space is always very exciting, and the members in the community as well are awesome. So that's really great to hear. And
Yes.
yeah, and I'm also very curious to understand, how has your career shown you that there are multiple career paths and like a mix of skill sets that can lead to a fulfilling life dedicated to space exploration? Because a part of my interview series is to show the diverse skill sets you need to be a part of space, and you don't have to just be good at math or just be good at science in order to be a part of the space industry. So I'm curious about that. Your thoughts.
I am a poster child for not having the traditional skills. I'm a walking exhibit that if you have sufficient curiosity and motivation, that you can find your niche in this world. If you went back and interviewed the Courtney Stadd at 16, let's say, or even newly graduated, college graduated Courtney at 22, I would have talked to you about aspiring to be in the Foreign Service. I had a long time interest in the world of international relations and development. And I happened to work as an assistant editor at the Georgetown Foreign Service School. Look at the school I went to. And the newspaper that was sort of the alternative voice, if you will, to the established paper. And I went over and interviewed the Director General of Foreign Service. And this was in the midst of Vietnam sort of declining, and we were beginning to pull out of Vietnam. There's a lot of attrition going on in the Foreign Service. And I remember I wrote up the interview and I said, I don't think this is for me. And as luck would have it, fate, I ran into a associate dean of a graduate school at Georgetown who had gone through a midlife crisis and decided to shift from Slavic studies to space. And we got into a discussion in terms of the potential of space. And that led me to meet the legendary Dr. Jerry O'Neill at Princeton, who was a godparent of one of this dean's kids. And that led to forming an institute, the first interdisciplinary institute for the study of social science study of space. And I became an editor at our first journal. So that became sort of my postgraduate study. There really wasn't the equivalent in the country. So and then I read about an ad that they were looking for somebody to run publications of the National Space Institute at the time. Your listeners probably know it today as the Space Society. And I went over there, got hired. And today you Ad Astra is the newsletter I founded. That became my education. And I guess what I would say to those it takes a certain mind and making no judgment. Maybe it's a curse. I don't like orthodoxy. I don't like doctrine. I don't like status quo. And I'm not built to go work in a what I call a derivative environment. No criticism at all of people who are built for that. I'm just not. So but along with that comes the pain and the agony of building new. And many of the things I've been associated with have been building from scratch. The good news is that there's plenty of opportunity in this environment. If the organization you want to work with doesn't exist, Ignite is an example. Build it. If you don't see a particular path vis-a-vis your passion, your skill, there are ways that you can forge your way toward it. I mentioned some nonprofits I work with, and I find nonprofits are terrific places to begin to explore and develop your interest as well. So there are lots of different avenues, both within the academy and outside in the private sector, to pursue your passions. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And, before we kind of jump into how you got into space industry, because I'm curious how you got into more of the space policy side, first before that, I would like to ask you, you were able to accomplish so much in the space industry as, we were talking about the various, initiatives and cool things you're a part of, and you had the opportunity to, work with amazing companies. How were you able to get the inspiration and motivation to do so much that's even unconventional or not, readily accepted in the space industry in the beginning, like even if it meant opposing officials? Where did you get your motivation from?
I don't know, part of it, how much of it is environment, how much of it is genetic. I don't know. I think that when I think back to my late father, he was very unorthodox. He literally created his own business factory. He was an engineer, practically out of nothing. And he took on the very, very big actors in his space. And I think as a kid, that inspired me. My father was also a veritable genius. And I knew as a kid, I didn't have to be much of a Freudian to know I couldn't compete with him in that area. But I could perhaps achieve some equivalence in the business policy development area, marketing area. And I suspect that's, if you looked into my psychology, that had been part of the motivation for the career that I took. But I've always felt a bit of an outsider, and that probably has been of some use to me. I think I've been attracted to the outsider entrepreneur. I did have opportunities along the way to work with some of the larger contractors, the Lockheeds and Boeings and so forth. And I just knew at the time that it fit for many of my friends, but it probably would have been frustrating for me. By the way, if I'd done it at my age, I'd have a nice equity situation. I'd have a great pension. I've been involved with a number of bankruptcies and failures along the way, but I like to say that I probably have better stories than they do. But I've met some extraordinary people, and hopefully ongoing will continue to have great experiences in this business. And it met a lot of opposition. The NASA that you know today, in many ways, was not the NASA that my colleagues and I dealt with 30 years ago. There were a lot of people from the Apollo era who regarded us in the commercial world with a bit of patronizing arrogance. I'll never forget sitting in a interagency meeting about 30 years ago, and one of the senior NASA officials was arguing there was no way we could rely on the private sector to manage safely a launch. And I spoke up because I was one of the few people in the room that actually worked in the private sector, and I was asked to come into the government at the time for a while. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, when I look at mission control in the 80s, I see jackets on your contractors that have an ink after their name. And they're sitting in the front row overseeing the safety of the mission. Yes, the Air Force, in the case of some of the ranges and NASA, others have at that point in time had say over termination. But to simply sit there and glibly deny the ability of the private sector to safely manage the program, which probably would shock many of your peers today as they watch the latest successful flight of the Dragon. That was part of the attitude that we dealt with. And there was an extraordinary antibody reaction when those of us were pushing for NASA to step more into the research role and let the private sector fill the void in terms of providing launch services and satellites and so forth. We still find pockets of resistance, but it's much less so as people have retired and have been replaced by a younger generation that, in my humble opinion, get it. And so I remain optimistic that over time, that role of NASA accepting the role of buyer of service will become more and more ingrained in the culture.
Yeah, I first off just have to say I definitely believe in the way that the family environment you're around, the people you're brought up with, definitely has a huge impact on your mindset and the way you think about situations and going outside of the normal and, doing whatever you think is best for, even if it means to go against some of the higher officials, being able to advocate for your voice and, make it heard is really important that we all should trust in ourselves to do.
We should, and I must tell you that that I didn't suddenly come out of the womb with all of this. I came out with extreme public speaking anxiety and other challenges, personal challenges. It sounds like a cliche, but for anybody who feels some level of inferiority, welcome to the human population. We all feel it in some ways. It hadn't been diagnosed at the time, so I didn't realize that I had certain anxieties. I just fought through it, but it was not fun. But I would say to those who have certain challenges, be they physical or be they mental or emotional, first of all, there are amazing therapies available today that weren't around 30, 40 years ago. So don't hesitate to seek assistance. But secondly, they can be managed, they can be overcome. I think the other good thing, if you allow me to add, is the incredible diversity I'm seeing in the community. When I headed up the NASA transition for George W. Bush, I was aghast when I looked at 50 years of white male people like me running the agency. And I remember turning to my deputy at the time on the transition team, who was half Asian, I might add. And I said, I got to think that there are a lot of women out there, a lot of people of color, people of different ancestries in America that have the acumen and the ability to lead the agency. And I'm very proud to say that we promoted and ultimately were successful in the first man of color, Fred Gregory, an amazing person of accomplishment, about 5 or 6 shuttle missions, for example, to be the deputy. And I'm also proud of the fact that I'm seeing more and more, painfully slow, I like to see it more rapidly, but there are more women, the more people of color. There should be more, but I'm seeing more of it. We need to do a lot better job on that front. But diversity is really a source of strength, both in this country and particularly in the aerospace field. And as many of you are aware, I hope, the Hidden Figures was an example, in this instance, a woman of color, brilliant mathematicians who were instrumental to the success of the space program, particularly back during the Mercury Gemini era, for example. But there are many more comparable stories that are beginning to emerge. But good news, in 2021, I'm seeing a lot of progress on that front, including women that are running more and more of these space companies. And again, I like to see more of it, but it's heading in the right direction.
Yes, I 100% agree. Diversity is strength, and it's important to, push for that even more and further. We all have different skill sets and strengths, so being
Correct.
able to account for the different perspectives is very important, especially in such a growing and important industry like space.
And we need them all: artists, scientists,
Yes.
engineers, poets, We've yet to get somebody up there. Astronauts have many skills, often poetry, with some exceptions. There've been a few that we've sent up are not his or her main skill. So we really haven't sent yet people who have the artistic sensibility to begin to really convey to the world's population that magnificent desolation that Buzz Aldrin famously characterized the moon some decades ago. And so there is a tremendous opportunity, but it ain't easy and it's hard. And if you want a challenge and you don't mind putting your shoulder to the metaphorical door day in and day out, but you want to leave a legacy that is no less than transformational, because during your lifetime, I'm convinced, and I might even live to see it, but certainly you will, you and your peers, we will discover life. Even if it's a fossilized one or two-celled organism, we will discover it, let alone perhaps life itself in some form. Maybe in Europa, the oceans, maybe Titan. Choose your opportunity. That will have an incredible effect on the global psyche. And I believe you're also part of the generation that'll be part of what I call the global migration, human migration into space on a permanent basis. So not only will we have the first woman step on the moon soon, we hope, and I believe this administration, although they're going to probably push it to the right, I don't think 2024 is the date, they'll probably push it to the right. But I think within a foreseeable horizon, that will happen. And that will be the down payment on a permanent settlement. And that's huge. And that will represent all sorts of challenges, because we're now taking our baggage, good and bad. As history has shown, humanity is capable of wonderful things, and we're capable of some really, really bad things. There's nothing magical about the cosmos. We're going to bring all that with us, and all sorts of major challenges as to the nature of humanity, how living in microgravity environments will change us as a species, and what effect that'll have on governance, culture. Again, those who are fans of The Expanse will remember that there's a discrimination against the belters in the asteroid belt, the miners, and the earthers, those of us living at the bottom of the gravity well, as well as people from Mars. And I remember there's some compelling episodes where some of the humans from Mars, but they've been altered because of the gravity difference, were distinguished by their sort of lopsided walking in the Earth's gravity well, and they suffered a form of discrimination. So how enlightened will we be? And by the way, those listening that are interested in sociology, anthropology, let alone space law, etc., those are whole fields that are opening up and provide endless opportunities for career, let alone the engineers and the scientists that will be fundamental to getting us out of the gravity well, at least part of the way, to explore these other incredible frontiers.
Yeah, as like an enthusiast of space medicine, I can, the future of how, different space environmental factors impact human body, and like hopefully colonization in space just excites me so much. And, I definitely, the future of space in many different aspects, not only space medicine, but space policy and everything beyond it's so exciting for all of us.
Just give you an example. I know we're getting to the end, but example of how your listeners can find all sorts of interesting opportunities. I happened to go to a conference on space, and I was sort of sitting back in the auditorium, half falling asleep during one of the panels that was droning on. And one of the researchers on the panel happened to mention that had an FAA funded opportunity to go in a human centrifuge, and that you could sign up at the end of the conference. And that's all I was focused on. I didn't listen to anything else they were saying on the panel. And I figured, oh boy, I'm at the end of the panel, a couple hundred people in the audience. There's no way that I'll have an opportunity to sign up. Well, I made my way to that researcher, and I was the only one. And I said, look, this is about maybe 4 years ago. And I said, I'm in my just starting 60 at the time. I'm overweight. You're perfect. Probably I'll never hear that again. He said, you're a perfect specimen for what we have in mind. And I signed up. I had medical waivers that I had to get. It was an academic funded study at the University of Texas. And they were looking at people at different ages and genders and so forth, health, to see how we would react to the stresses of space travel. The next scene, I was traveling to Navstar outside Philadelphia. I live here in Bethesda, Maryland. And I had an incredible time. I spent half the day learning about microgravity, low G, high G environment. And then they wired me up, took me out to the gondola, as they call it, and strapped me in. And I went through a couple of different scenarios of what it was like to, for example, they took me through the Virgin Galactic, where many of you may be aware, it's a rocket underneath a mothership, and then the rocket is sent into low Earth orbit, or in this case, suborbital. And I went through the entire scenario. So anything short of micro, and I'm spinning around at 90 miles an hour, and it was just great. And they sent me through different stresses. My only point is that was an opportunity that came along. Who would have guessed? And that's part of life, is that it comes along, you grab it, you don't, and that had a big impact on the way I view space travel, and it made me very excited. So much and so they couldn't get me out of the gondola. They were very kind and letting me do another scenario. But there were others, I was told, who would show up, travel across the country, brag to their friends and family they're going to do this experiment, would do the classroom, be wired up, walk out to the gondola, I can't do it, and walk away from it. And that's important too, because when you're being strapped to a controlled explosive, it's very sobering. And that's part of the other challenge one has in looking at this, and as to how one wants to play in this environment. Some people want to be on that rocket, and there are plenty of opportunities for those who want to be what I'll call the supporting cast. But however you look at it, there's an extraordinary world above us that's waiting for all of us, but particularly your peers and your generation. I'm envious.
Yeah, if I was like you and I had the opportunity to go on that mission, I would be doing so many simulations. I'd be like, can I do one more?
I have no doubt. As I've gotten to know you, I have no doubt.
Yes, and it's really nice that you were able to have that opportunity, and they're really trying to explore with different ages and diverse individuals to go into space. So they're not limiting it to only healthy individuals, but they're trying to make space more commercial, where it could potentially even be like just, how we have airplanes going from country to country. Maybe in the long run, we'll have something where we could go up to space and come back down for everyone, and that inclusive environment's very exciting.
And internationally, there are we could have a whole separate interview on activities. You and I talked about India the other day, Europe, Africa. There's some fascinating work going on. Asia, China, of course, is a big competitor of ours. And as much as a believer I am in international cooperation, and it is so critical to successful exploration of space, we must do this in alliance with as many countries as possible. There is, as our president said today at his news conference, there is a seminal battle ongoing between autocracy and democracy, or however you define the latter. Speaking personally, I have many good friends from China, and I respect immensely the work that Chinese have done in developing their taikonauts, their space habitats, their presence on the moon. But I am, shall we say, I prefer to have Western values shaping and driving. I say Western, but I would include our friends and certainly parts of Asia, India, obviously, to say the least. But I would be concerned about President Che dictating what that ought to be. The difference being that if I was in China saying this, I probably would be prosecuted. And I'd rather live in an environment where we can be free and say what we want to say. But with that said, I'm hoping there's as much cooperation as possible abroad, because there's some amazing work going on around the world in the world of rockets and satellites and so forth. So.
Yeah, I know I was talking with other individuals and we were all agreeing how maybe the first human Mars mission could be like a collaborative thing because it's a huge budget, a lot of technology and a lot of security needs to happen, and being able to do that collaboratively would be a huge step forward for all of us.
There should be, and again, I know we're going beyond the deadline, but I'm eager to say this. The United States by no means has a monopoly on what the governance regimes should be, the values, the cultures. This is if there was nothing else that screamed out for global collaboration, it is exploring the cosmos. Nobody should be allowed, and nobody has a monopoly on that. So I think we need and must find ways of working together. And by the way, as I speak to you, with all the issues ongoing with President Putin, another person that I hope doesn't have much influence on our future in terms of the values we have in space. But we have our Russian cosmonauts that are cohabiting very nicely, thank you very much, with Americans and Europeans, for example. And that's been a very nice case study in how space cooperation often transcends the terrestrial turf battles and competition that we have. But I have to say that watching and reading the Chinese plans, they do intend, they make no bones about it, to be the Chinese century within the next 25, 30 years. And they have established a robotic presence on the moon, the ultimate high ground. And as anybody in the military knows, having a high ground is key. And we have to counterbalance that. Again, for those of your listeners who are pacifists and don't want to introduce military to space, I respect that. But we can't also ignore the fact, as I said earlier, it's the human species, good and bad. And we're going to take that with us. And we have to be realistic and pragmatic in how we look to perpetuate the good, the best in our species in space.
Yeah, I appreciate that, like, different, unique insight, because that's definitely a unique perspective and, a different thought process. I feel like a lot of people tend not to acknowledge because they don't want to think of the negative or the, political race in space. So definitely being able to acknowledge and move past it and maybe even overcome it is definitely important. But acknowledging it and not ignoring it is really important.
That's the first and major step, agreed.
Yeah. And now that we were able to understand more of the amazing work you've been doing, as well as get into a lot about space and how you got into space policy, because I know it's a very unique career, but there's a lot of diverse careers out in space. My last question for you is, looking back over the past 4 decades, what lessons have you learned that you would like to pass on to the next generation of space pathfinders from your experience?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that. So I wrote a note here and said that probably the biggest lesson, and it's one I think you can apply to any sphere of life. But as I've attempted to carve out a career in the space arena with dealing with established players, orthodoxy, trying to work with other colleagues and creating new opportunity and entrepreneurship, there's a statement from that great novelist and observer of humanity, Mark Twain, the 19th century great observer of the human, what I call the human comedy. And this is ingrained. And I have a quote wall in my office.
That's awesome.
And I read it every day. And this is one of the main quotes. And it says, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And that to me is a sobering thought. And I think trying to fight the sense that one has all the answers and learning from our predecessors. There have been many valuable lessons to be learned from the pioneers to date. I don't mean in any shape or form to disregard that, but take the best, build on that, lessons learned, move on, and make your own unique mistakes. And this is a very tough business. And it is a business where you're dealing at hyper velocities, you're dealing with unbelievable pressures and so forth, in a fundamentally different medium. You know, when you fly, you stay more or less within the atmosphere. Obviously, you need certain levels to to have air injected and so forth, but an atmospheric pressure is maintained. But in space, it's a radically different environment. And in pursuing it, we will lose life. We will have accidents. And the big test for humanity will be to learn from those, not to stand down, not to be immobilized, learn from it and move on, develop new, sometimes governance, culture, indemnification policies, things that may bore your audience, but they're key to letting you get into a car, put the key in the ignition and drive down a highway, is a function of decades and decades of legal and risk management practice. And we're just at the beginning of that in developing space. So for my libertarian friends, of which I have many, God love you, but at some point there's going to at least be a need for some modicum of governance and regulatory framework at some level. But no matter who you are, no matter what approach you take in life, keep Mark Twain on your shoulder. And I think that admonition from him is one that is probably the lesson that I've gleaned from 40 years of the ups and downs in this really wonderful and very exciting world of space exploration.
Thank you, Mr. Stadd, for sharing that amazing quote with us and giving us a different, perspective on not only space policy, life, and how there's ups and downs, but it's always about, following your passion and your beliefs and not being afraid to go against the, conventional views and ideologies, because we wouldn't have been able to advance in space as greatly as we did today, without those brave people stepping out of their comfort zone to, express their thoughts and views. So I want to thank you so much, Mr. Stadd, for taking some time to do this. I really appreciate your thoughts and views, and truly it was a motivational, inspirational, and insightful conversation.
It was a privilege. Thank you very much.